Marcus wasted no time. 72 hours. That was all it took for a man to dismantle 40 years of a life that was not his to touch. The auction sign went up while the dirt on Walter Hale's grave was still fresh. Dorothy had not yet changed out of her black dress. She had not yet sat down. She had not yet allowed herself to feel the full weight of what the morning had taken from her. And there it was planted at the end of the gravel drive like a flag of conquest. Auction today. Marcus was on the porch when she arrived. He had already changed out of his funeral clothes. Dark suit now, phone in hand. The practiced composure of a man who had been waiting for this moment and had decided somewhere between the graveside and that afternoon that waiting was finished. Dad's will was clear, Dorothy, he said. You have 3 days to collect your things. He said it the way a man reads a contract clause. Not cruel enough to be a villain in a story, just efficient enough to be devastating in real life. Dorothy looked at him, then at the sign, then past both of them toward the old oak tree at the edge of the drive, the one Walter had planted the year they were married, the one that had outlasted 4 decades of hard winters, dry summers, and every difficult thing the land had asked of them. She did not speak. She did not need to. Not yet. Marcus sold the farm. He sold the memory of it. He sold the smell of the morning fields, the creak of the granary door, and 40 years of 2 people building something that had outlasted almost everything except greed. What he did not know, what he had never thought to look for, was that Walter had been thinking about this long before Marcus started counting. Walter never put all his eggs in one basket. 40 years of farming had taught him that. You prepared for the weather you could see coming. Then you prepared for the weather you could not? 5 years earlier, on a Tuesday morning in October, Walter had driven to a county clerk's office 2 towns over. He had brought a document prepared by a lawyer whose name Marcus had never heard. He had signed it in front of a notary. He had paid the filing fee in cash. The document was called a quitclaim deed, and a certified copy was sitting in a rusted tin box beneath the floor of the old granary in the building Marcus had dismissed as worthless behind a door only one key could open. A key that had hung from Walter's belt every day for 40 years. A key that Dorothy now held in her hand. Marcus had put up his auction sign. He had made his calls. He had moved with the speed of a man who understood that speed was his greatest advantage. He was right about that. He just had not understood that Walter had moved faster, 5 years faster. And what Walter had put in motion on that Tuesday morning in October could not be undone by a sign in a driveway, a 15-year-old will, or 3 days' notice delivered in a suit that still smelled like the funeral. The deed was already hers. Marcus just did not know it yet. The funeral was on a Monday. By Thursday, Marcus had brought 3 men with clipboards. Dorothy watched them from the kitchen window the way they moved through the yard, with the particular efficiency of people who have already decided what something is worth and are simply confirming the number. One of them walked the fence line with a measuring wheel. Another photographed the equipment barn. The third stood near the granary and wrote something down without going inside, which told Dorothy he was estimating rather than examining, which told her everything she needed to know about how seriously any of them were taking this property. Marcus came through the front door without knocking. He had his tablet in his hand, the kind of device that reduces everything to columns and figures, that turns acres into square footage and years of labor into depreciated assets. He set it on Walter's kitchen table and turned it to face Dorothy and said, "Everything needs to be settled before Sunday. That's 4 days. I've arranged for the auction house to handle the farm equipment separately. The land and the house go together." Dorothy looked at the tablet. She looked at the spreadsheet on it, the farm she had lived on for 40 years, reduced to line items the house she had painted twice, and the barn. Walter had re-roofed himself in the summer of 2009, and the south field she had walked every morning since before Marcus was old enough to know what a mortgage was. She said, "This was your father's farm, Marcus," Marcus said. "And now it's part of his estate." His will was clear. The will. He had mentioned the will every day since Monday. He carried it the way a man carries a weapon he has been waiting to use, with the particular confidence of someone who believes the document in his hand settles every question before it can be asked. Dorothy did not ask about the will, not yet. The men with clipboards came back in the afternoon with 2 more. They moved through the house room by room, and Dorothy stood in the hallway and watched them open closets and measure walls and write things down. And she thought about Walter, who had known every room of this house by feel, who could walk it in the dark without touching a wall, who had once said to her standing in the doorway of the kitchen after a long day that a house becomes part of you. If you stay in it long enough, that you stop distinguishing between where you end and where the house begins. Marcus came to find her at the kitchen table where she had sat down, because there was nowhere to go that wasn't being measured or photographed. He sat across from her. He had a document with a signature line at the bottom. He said, "This is just a transfer acknowledgement. It makes the probate process faster for everyone. Sign here and we can avoid most of the administrative delay." Dorothy looked at the document. She said, "I'd like to have someone look at this first." Marcus said, "It's standard paperwork. My attorney drafted it." She said, "Then it will still be standard paperwork after someone else looks at it." Something moved behind Marcus's expression, a brief recalibration, the flash of a man who had expected less resistance and is deciding whether to press or redirect. He redirected. He picked up the document and folded it and put it back in his folder and said, "I'll give you some time to think about it." He left the document on the table. She left it there, too. She heard him in Walter's office in the late afternoon. The office was at the back of the house. Walter's space organized the way Walter organized everything, with the methodical precision of a man who believed that knowing where things were was a form of respect for the things themselves. She heard drawers opening, the particular metallic sound of a combination lock being tried. Then silence. Then the sound of the combination being tried again. She walked to the doorway and stood there. Marcus was at the safe in the corner, the small one Walter had kept behind the filing cabinet, the one she knew held insurance documents and the deed to the truck, and the original papers from when they had refinanced the property 15 years ago. Marcus turned when he heard her. He said, "Do you know the combination?" She said, "Walter never gave it to me." Marcus looked at the safe for a moment. Then he turned back to his tablet and made a note. He said, "We'll have a locksmith come by Friday. It's probably just the vehicle titles." He was not concerned. She could see that clearly. He was not concerned because he had the will, and the will was 15 years old and had Walter's signature on it, and Marcus had decided that the will was sufficient. He had not looked for anything else because he had not believed there was anything else to find. She was setting out her coat for the next morning when she saw it. Walter's desk in the corner of the bedroom, the small one he kept there for the bills, and the farm accounts, the one with the shallow center drawer that stuck in humid weather. She had not been to the desk since Monday. She had not been ready. She went to it now. She opened the center drawer. Pens, a small notepad, a rubber band, the ordinary equipment of a desk that had been used daily for decades. And in the back corner of the drawer, resting against the wood as if it had been set there deliberately, a key. Not a house key, not a truck key. The granary key, the old one, the one Walter had worn on his belt every day for 40 years, the one she had seen at his waist so many times she had stopped seeing it the way you stop seeing things that have always been there. She picked it up. She held it in her palm. Walter's voice arrived the way it had been arriving all week, not as memory exactly, more as presence, the way a person persists in the rooms they have inhabited completely. She heard him as clearly as if he were standing behind her. Dorothy, he had said she could not now place exactly when, only that he had said it quietly, in the way he said things he meant permanently. If anything ever happens, this key opens the truth. She had not known what he meant. She was beginning to understand. She closed her fingers around the key. Through the bedroom window visible in the last of the Thursday light, Marcus was in the yard below. He had his phone to his ear. He was looking at the granary, the old building at the south end of the yard, the one he had dismissed this morning as structurally marginal, the one his appraiser had photographed from the outside and not entered. He was looking at it the way a man looks at something he has already written off. He did not know what was inside. He did not know about the key in Dorothy's hand. He had the will, and the will felt sufficient, and speed was his strategy, and Sunday was 3 days away. He had not understood yet that Walter had been moving in a different direction entirely quietly 5 years ago in a county clerk's office 2 towns over, and that the key Dorothy now held was the first thing Marcus had failed to account for. She put it in her coat pocket. She went downstairs. The auction sign was in the yard, red and white, catching the last of the light. She looked at it through the kitchen window without expression. 3 days. Walter had given her more than 3 days. He had given her 5 years of preparation hidden in a rusted tin box in a building Marcus had already decided was worthless. She just needed to get there first. The auction people arrived at 8 in the morning. Dorothy had been up since 5. She had made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the early dark, the way she had sat at it every morning for 40 years, and she had watched the light come up over the south field, the particular gray-pink of a November dawn, the kind that doesn't promise warmth but delivers a certain honest clarity. She had watched it the way you watch things you are not sure how many more times you will see. By 8, there were vehicles on the gravel drive. By 8:30, there were strangers in the house. They moved through it with the practiced efficiency of people who do this work regularly and have learned not to look at objects as objects but as lots, as numbered units to be assessed. Tagged, move sold. A woman in a red vest worked through the living room, fixing small numbered stickers to the legs of chairs, the undersides of tables, the frames of pictures. A man photographed the kitchen appliances. Another carried Walter's armchair, the one he had sat in every evening for 20 years, the one that still held the particular compression of a man who had used it completely, out to the lawn, and set it in the row of items that was forming along the fence. Dorothy stood in the doorway and watched. She did not try to stop any of it. She had understood since Thursday that trying to stop the surface of things was not the same as addressing the foundation of them, and that what needed addressing was below the surface in the granary in the rusted tin box she had not yet had the opportunity to reach. She went to the porch. She sat in the wooden chair at the far end, the one place that was not yet tagged, not yet measured, not yet decided about, and she folded her hands in her lap and she watched. The lawn filled by 9 o'clock. Neighbors she recognized. People from town she knew by face, if not by name. A group of men in work jackets who had the look of buyers who attended these sales professionally, who moved through the lots with practiced eyes, touching things briefly to assess quality and setting them down again without sentiment. One of them picked up the ceramic lamp from the side table, the blue one with the hand-painted base that Walter's mother had given them the first Christmas after they were married, turned it over, set it down, moved on. Dorothy watched this from the porch. She did not look away. The auctioneer set up his podium near the oak tree, the old one, the one Walter had planted the year they were married, the one that had grown large enough that its roots were lifting the edge of the gravel path. She thought about that, the roots of a tree Walter had planted, pushing up through the ground, insisting on the space they needed, doing what living things do when they have been given enough time. Marcus was near the barn talking to 2 men in clean boots who were not the sort of people who came to farm auctions. They had the look of development money, the pressed jeans, and the careful casualness of people who buy land not to work it, but to hold it until it becomes something else. He was showing them something on his tablet. He was smiling. Harold Briggs came to find her on the porch. He was 81 years old and had farmed the property adjacent to theirs for 50 years, and had known Walter since before Dorothy had. He walked slowly now, with the particular careful gait of a man whose knees have logged too many miles, and he came to the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps and looked up at her. He said, "Dorothy, I'm sorry about Walter." She said, "Thank you, Harold." He said, "I'm sorry about this, too." He gestured slightly toward the lawn and the strangers and the numbered lots and the auction podium set up under the oak tree that Walter had planted. She said, "I know." He came up the steps and sat in the other chair and took her hand in both of his large hands, work-worn the hands of a man who had spent his life in fields, and held it. He did not say anything further. He simply sat with her, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done, and she was grateful for it in the specific way that you are grateful for things that cost someone something. They sat together while the auctioneer tested his microphone and the crowd settled into its formations, and Marcus moved through it all with the ease of a man in his element. She heard him at some point speaking to one of the development buyers near the equipment barn. She did not turn to look. She heard his voice carrying across the yard with the particular projection of a man who does not lower it because he does not believe he needs to. He said everything is completely legal. She's just been staying here. It's not really her place. The words landed the way certain words land, not like blows, but like cold water, the kind that takes the breath and clarifies things at the same time. She had known in some approximate way what Marcus thought of her place here. She had known it since Monday, since the suit, instead of the funeral clothes, since the clipboard men on Thursday. Hearing it said aloud in that voice to a stranger on her front lawn clarified the full shape of it. She was not angry. She was done. The auctioneer raised his gavel. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin with the primary parcel, 42 acres, including the main residence outbuildings, and Dorothy stood up. She did not look at Marcus. She did not look at the auctioneer or the development buyers or the neighbors with their expressions of helpless sympathy. She did not look at Walter's armchair on the lawn or the blue ceramic lamp or the numbered tags on 40 years of a shared life. She looked at the granary. The old building at the south end of the yard, gray wood, low roof lined the door with its old iron hardware that Marcus's appraiser had photographed from 10 feet away and not entered. The building that Marcus had listed as structurally marginal. The building whose floor held something Marcus had never known existed. She walked toward it, not quickly, not dramatically, the way a woman walks when she knows where she is going and has known for a while, and has simply been waiting for the right moment to go. The granary key was in her coat pocket. Walter had worn it on his belt for 40 years. She had carried it for 2 days. Behind her, the auctioneer began to call the opening bid on the land that Walter had worked for 4 decades and that Marcus believed he had the right to sell. Dorothy did not look back. She reached the granary door. She put the key in the lock. The granary smelled like 40 years. Dust and old grain and the particular dry smell of seasoned wood that has been standing through decades of weather without complaint. The smell of a building that has done its job and kept its silence. Dorothy stood in the doorway for a moment after the lock turned and let the smell come to her, let her eyes adjust from the bright November morning to the low interior light. She had been in this building perhaps 24 times in 40 years. It was Walter's space in the way the desk was Walter's space, and the south field at dawn was Walter's space, not forbidden, just specifically his belonging to him, in the way that certain things belong to certain people after enough years of association. She went inside and pulled the door mostly closed behind her. The sound of the auction came through the walls, muffled but present. The auctioneer's voice, the particular cadence of the opening lot, the low murmur of the crowd settling into the rhythm of it. She could hear Marcus's voice occasionally, the carrying tenor of a man conducting business he considers already concluded. She did not hurry. Hurrying was Marcus's strategy. Speed was what he had counted on from the beginning, the 72-hour clock the clipboard men the auction scheduled before the week was out. Speed was the weapon of a man who needed the transaction completed before anyone thought to ask the questions that would stop it. Dorothy moved carefully. She moved the way Walter had moved through this building, with the particular attentiveness of a person who knows a space well enough to respect its details. The floor was original to the building. Wide pine planks, dark with age, fitted with the close tolerance of old carpentry that had dried and settled over decades into a near seamless surface. She walked it slowly, feeling the give of each board under her weight, listening. Walter had told her once, standing in this doorway, on an evening she could not now precisely date, but could feel the quality of the light and the temperature suggesting late summer, that the best place to keep something safe was somewhere ordinary. Not a safe, not a lockbox, not anywhere a person would think to look if they were looking for something hidden. Somewhere that required knowing what you were looking for before you could find it. She had not known at the time that he was telling her something specific. She knew now. She moved to the back left corner, the corner furthest from the door, the corner where the light was lowest, and the floor had been reinforced at some point with a secondary beam running beneath. She had known about the beam because Walter had mentioned it once when they were discussing whether the building needed structural work and he had said the back left corner was sound, that he had seen to it personally. She crouched down. She ran her hand along the seam between two boards until she felt it, the slight difference in resistance, the almost imperceptible looseness of a board that has been lifted and replaced rather than simply settled into place over decades. She worked her fingers into the seam and lifted. The board came up cleanly. Below it, in the space between the floor and the secondary beam, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept the moisture out the tin box. It was smaller than she had imagined. The size of a shoebox, roughly the metal gone to rust at the corners and along the seam, but holding its shape, the lid fitted tightly in the way of something that had been closed with intention. She lifted it out and set it on the floor beside her. Outside, the auctioneer called a number, and a ripple of response went through the crowd. She heard the gavel. One lot sold. The morning moving forward. She opened the box. Inside, wrapped in the same oilcloth as the exterior, two items. A folded document, thick paper, the kind that carries official weight, and beneath it a single folded page, her name written on the outside in Walter's handwriting, not his formal print, but his personal script, the rounder, less compressed hand he used for things that were not official but were important. She took the document first. She unfolded it carefully. The heading was clear: Quitclaim Deed. The legal language of the body was dense, but she moved through it the way she moved through things that mattered, line by line, without skipping. She found the parties named. She found the property description, the legal description of the 42 acres, the metes and bounds, the parcel number that matched every tax document she had received for 4 decades. She found the date 5 years ago, October. She found the signatures, Walter's, the notary's, the county recorder's stamp in the corner. She found her name. Dorothy Ann Webb, grantee, sole owner of record as of the date of this instrument. She read it twice. The deed was valid. The deed was recorded. The deed predated every claim Marcus had made, every document he had presented, every number on every spreadsheet on his tablet. A quitclaim deed properly executed and filed with the county recorder 5 years before Walter's death transferred the property entirely outside the reach of the estate. The 15-year-old will that Marcus had been carrying like a weapon could not touch property that no longer belonged to the estate, could not touch property that had been Dorothy's legally and completely since an October morning 5 years ago. Walter had known exactly what he was doing. She set the deed beside her on the floor and took the folded page. She opened it. Walter's handwriting. The personal script slightly unsteady at the edges, in the way it had been in his last years, but precise where it mattered, deliberate in the way of a man who has chosen every word. Dorothy, if you're reading this, then something happened the way I was afraid it would. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to stop it in the room. I've watched Marcus for a long time. I love my son. I know him. And I know that what he calls protecting his inheritance is really something else, something that started when he was young, and I couldn't fix it and got harder as the years went on. I made peace with that a long time ago. What I couldn't make peace with was the thought of you standing alone in the middle of it. This farm is yours, Dorothy, not mine to give yours already. Has been for 5 years. I signed the deed when I still could, filed it myself at the county clerk's office, paid the fee, took the copy home and put it here. I told no one. I did it quietly because quiet was the only way it would hold. Don't let them take it. You have the paper now. The paper is the truth. I'm sorry I didn't tell you while I could. I thought telling you would worry you. You were always better at carrying things than I gave you credit for. That was my mistake. This is me correcting it. The farm is yours. It has always been yours. I just made sure the county agreed. All my love as I have had it, which has been more than I knew how to say, Walter. She read it once. She sat on the floor of the granary with the deed in one hand and the letter in the other, and the sound of the auction coming through the walls, the gavel, the numbers, the crowd, Marcus's voice somewhere in the middle of it, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was holding. Not the paper. What the paper meant. What it had taken to produce it, Walter, in a county clerk's office 5 years ago by himself, for her quietly and without announcement, because quiet was the only way it would hold. Walter preparing for a future he hoped wouldn't happen, and couldn't be certain would doing the thing that needed doing in the only way it could be done. He had called it offense. She remembered now the exact conversation, the exact tone of it. He had been ill, not yet seriously, but the beginning of the seriousness, and she had been worried, in the specific way. She was always worried when she couldn't see the full shape of something, and he had taken her hand and said, "I've put up a fence for you, Maggie. Something that'll hold even if I can't." She had thought he was being sentimental. He had been describing a quitclaim deed filed with the Montgomery County Recorder. She folded the letter along its original crease. She placed it inside the deed, folded together. She held them in both hands for a moment. Then she stood up. Outside, the gavel came down again. She heard the auctioneer begin to introduce the primary parcel, the land, the house, the whole, of the 42 acres that Marcus believed he had the right to sell to the men in clean boots who wanted to build something that was not a farm. Dorothy put the deed in her coat pocket. She straightened her coat. She pushed the granary door open and walked out into the November morning. Not quickly, not with the urgency of a woman who had been running, with the particular steadiness of a woman who knew where she stood and what she was carrying and what happened next. The auction was in front of her, the crowd, the podium, the oak tree Walter had planted, Marcus near the front tablet and a hand satisfaction in the set of his shoulders. She walked toward it. Walter had built her a fence. She was about to show Marcus where it stood. The auctioneer was mid-sentence when Dorothy stepped in front of the podium. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply walked to the front of the crowd and turned to face the auctioneer and said clearly and without inflection, "Stop the auction. This transaction is not legal." The auctioneer stopped. The crowd stopped with him, that particular collective stillness of a group of people who have been moving in one direction and have encountered something that requires them to reconsider. The murmur that had been running through the yard went quiet. The people with their numbered paddles lowered them. The two men in clean boots looked at each other. Marcus looked at Dorothy. He had been standing to the left of the podium, close to the development buyers, in the posture of a man who has already concluded the difficult part of his morning and is waiting comfortably for the formalities to complete. He looked at her, the way a man looks at an unexpected complication, with the slight tightening of someone who is annoyed, but not concerned, who believes the complication is temporary. He said, "Dorothy, this isn't the time or place for..." She took the deed from her coat pocket. She held it out toward the auctioneer, not toward Marcus, not toward the crowd, but toward the man who was conducting the transaction, the man whose professional obligation required him to understand what he was selling before he sold it. She said, "This is a quitclaim deed for this property filed with the county recorder 5 years ago. My name is the only name on it. This farm belongs to me. It is not part of Walter Marsh's estate, and it cannot be sold through his will." The auctioneer, a man of about 50 who had the weather-beaten competence of someone who had been doing this work for a long time in all kinds of conditions, looked at the document she was holding. Then he looked at Marcus. Then he looked back at the document. He said, "Ma'am, I'm going to need a moment to..." Marcus said, "She's grieving. She doesn't understand what she's..." She said, "You can sell your father's will, Marcus, but you cannot sell my name." She said it quietly. She said it the way Walter had always said the things that mattered, without theatrical emphasis, without the performance of certainty, just the plain declarative sentence of a person who knows what is true and has decided to say it precisely once. The yard was very still. Lawyer Miller had been standing at the edge of the crowd. Dorothy had not known he would be there. She had not planned for him to be there, had not known until this moment that the man Francis had called on her behalf 2 days ago, the one who had said he would look into things and get back to her, had come to the auction himself and been standing among the crowd, watching and waiting with the specific patience of a man who had understood before he arrived what the morning was likely to require. He came forward now through the crowd, not quickly, but with the directness of a man who knows where he is going, and he stopped beside Dorothy and held out his hand for the deed. She gave it to him. He unfolded it with the deliberate care of a man handling something whose significance he had already assessed and wanted to receive correctly. He put on his reading glasses. He read. He did not read quickly. He read the way attorneys read documents that matter, with the full attention of someone who is not looking for a general impression, but for the precise content of every line. The crowd watched him and said nothing. The auctioneer had stepped back from his podium. The development buyers had gone very still. Marcus moved. He came forward with the specific momentum of a man who has decided that the best response to an obstacle is to remove it, and his hand went out toward the deed, the reflexive reach of someone who has spent his adult life taking hold of things he wanted and finding that taking hold generally worked. Miller's hand came down on his wrist. Not roughly, precisely. He said, "Careful, Marcus. This is an original recorded document. Interfering with it in a public proceeding would compound your situation considerably." Marcus looked at him. Miller looked back with the particular expression of a man who has nothing to prove and knows it. Marcus lowered his hand. Miller finished reading. He turned to the second page. He found the notary seal, the county recorder's stamp, the date. He found Dorothy's name in the grantee line, sole owner of record, and he found the date of filing 5 years ago, October, registered in the county records during a period when Walter Marsh had been in full legal possession of his faculties and his affairs. He folded the deed carefully and held it in both hands. He looked at the auctioneer. He said, "This is a properly executed quitclaim deed recorded with the county 5 years prior to the decedent's death. The property described in this deed cannot be conveyed through the estate because it was transferred out of the grantor's ownership before death. Any sale proceeding on the basis of the 2009 will has no legal authority over this parcel." He said it in the measured, unhurried tone of a man reading a finding into the record, not arguing, not advocating, simply stating what the document said and what it meant. The auctioneer looked at Marcus. Marcus's face had been moving through a sequence of colors, the red of a man whose authority has been challenged in public, the white of a man who has heard something that changes the shape of things and has not yet found the new shape. He stood at the front of the crowd in his development meeting suit, and he looked at Miller, and at the deed in Miller's hands, and at Dorothy standing beside him, and he looked like what he was, a man who had built his entire strategy on one document and had just learned there was another one. He said, "That deed it could be a forgery, it could be..." Miller said, "It has a county recorder's stamp and a filing number. I can have the original county record verified within the hour. Can you say the same for the basis of your auction?" The crowd had been quiet. Now it was not. The murmur that ran through it was not the murmur of an audience following a drama. It was the specific concerned murmur of people with financial stakes in a transaction that had just developed a serious legal question. The development buyers were conferring in low voices. One of them had his phone out. A woman near the back who had driven 40 miles for the farm equipment lots was asking her husband something urgent. Marcus's auctioneer stepped down from the podium and walked to Marcus and said something close to his ear. Marcus listened. His jaw tightened. Dorothy watched all of this from where she stood. She was not watching it with triumph. She was watching it with the still attention of a woman who has done the thing that needed doing and is now allowing the consequences to arrange themselves the way consequences do when the right document has been placed in the right hands at the right moment. Walter always said, "Keep the most important paper somewhere they would never think to look." He had kept it under the floor of a building Marcus had dismissed as structurally marginal. He had been right about where to keep it. He had been right about everything. Miller handed the deed back to Dorothy. She put it in her coat pocket, the inner pocket, the one closest to her body. She looked at the oak tree. Walter had planted it the year they were married. Its roots were lifting the gravel at the edge of the drive, insisting on the space they had earned through 4 decades of growth. Some things, when they have been growing long enough, cannot be moved. Miller said to the auctioneer without drama, "You'll want to halt the proceedings pending legal review. I would recommend doing that now." The auctioneer reached for his gavel. He did not bring it down to conclude a sale. He brought it down to end one. Miller stepped to the front. He did not step forward with the energy of a man seizing a moment. He stepped forward with the measured deliberateness of a man who has assessed the situation, identified what it requires, and is now providing it the way a doctor moves in an emergency, not with haste, but with the specific economy of someone whose training has prepared them for exactly this. He held up one hand. The yard went quiet. He said, "I need everyone's attention for a moment. What I have to say affects all of you, particularly those of you who have placed deposits or made offers on this property today." The crowd rearranged itself toward him. The auctioneer had already stepped back. Marcus stood to the right of the podium. His tablet lowered his expression, still carrying the residue of the color change. Dorothy had watched move through him the red of public challenge, the white of genuine uncertainty, now settling into something that had not yet resolved into a recognizable expression, because he had not yet decided what he was looking at. Miller said, "I'm going to explain what has happened here because a number of you have financial stakes in this proceeding, and you deserve to understand the legal situation before this goes any further." He held the deed where the crowd could see it. He did not wave it. He simply held it as he would hold any document whose existence was the point. He said, "This is a quitclaim deed for the property at 4417 Webb Road, the 42 acres the primary residence and all outbuildings currently being offered for sale. It was executed 5 years ago by Walter Marsh, the property's former owner. It was notarized, witnessed, and filed with the county recorder's office. It transferred sole ownership of this property to Dorothy Ann Webb Marsh. From the date of that filing, the property ceased to be Walter Marsh's to distribute. It was no longer a part of his estate." He paused. He let that sentence stand in the air by itself. He said the will that was used to authorize this auction is 15 years old. It predates this deed by 10 years. Under standard property law, a quitclaim deed recorded during the owner's lifetime supersedes any prior testamentary disposition of the same property. The will has no legal authority over this parcel. It never did not from the moment this deed was filed. He looked directly at the auctioneer. He said, "This auction has no legal basis. The seller does not own what he is selling." Marcus came forward. He had reassembled something, not the full confidence of earlier in the morning, not the ease of a man conducting business he considered already concluded, but a functional version of it enough to push through the crowd and stand in front of Miller with his voice at the pitch of a man making an argument rather than losing one. He said Dorothy pressured him. She manipulated him into signing it. He was sick. He wasn't thinking clearly. Miller said the deed is dated 5 years ago. Marcus said, and Miller said, 5 years ago, Walter Marsh was not ill. His medical records, which I have reviewed with Dorothy's authorization, show no cognitive impairment at the date of signing, no diminished capacity, no indication of undue influence by any party. He was 68 years old, in good health, and in full legal possession of his faculties. He took off his reading glasses and held them at his side. He said, "You are describing a man who made a legal decision about his own property while entirely competent to do so. The deed is valid. The filing is valid. The timing makes your argument untenable." He said it without raising his voice. He said it with the flat, clean delivery of a man presenting a finding, not making a case. Marcus said, "I'll contest it. Miller said, "Marcus, you attempted to sell a property you did not own using a will you knew was 15 years old in a county where the property record shows a superseding deed in your stepmother's name. Whether you knew about the deed or not, the effect is the same. You have facilitated a fraudulent transaction. The people standing behind you who have placed deposits on this property today have a legal claim against you personally for the return of those funds plus costs." He let that land. Then he said, "That is constructive fraud. In this state, it carries civil liability. Depending on what the investigation determines about your prior knowledge of the deed's existence, it may carry more than that." The crowd behind Marcus had been quiet during this exchange. It was not quiet now. The specific sound that rose from it was not the murmur of an audience following a drama. It was the sharper, more urgent sound of people with money at stake, processing information that affected them directly. A man near the front who had driven from 3 counties over with a cashier's check for the equipment lots was already on his phone. The 2 development buyers were conferring with each other in the low, rapid exchange of people recalculating. A woman in a green coat, Dorothy did not know her, did not recognize her from the neighborhood, said loudly, "I put down a $5,000 deposit this morning. Who do I talk to about getting that back?" Several voices joined hers. Marcus turned. He was facing now not Dorothy and not Miller, but the people he had invited. The buyers he had assembled, the money he had moved, the transaction he had arranged with the speed and confidence of a man who had been certain of his legal ground. They were looking at him with the expressions of people who have discovered that the ground was not what they were told it was, and who intend to hold someone responsible for the discovery. He looked like what he was, a man who had outrun his own plan. Dorothy watched this from where she stood. She felt watching it something that was not satisfaction. It was quieter than satisfaction, and older, the specific feeling of watching a truth arrive at its correct destination after a long journey. Walter had known this day would come. He had known because he knew his son the way parents know their children, with the unsentimental clarity of long observation. He had not been surprised by Marcus's nature. He had simply prepared for it. The law is slow sometimes. Walter had said to her once, laughing slightly. She could not remember the specific occasion, only the quality of the afternoon, the warm kitchen light, the particular ease of a man who trusts eventually, even when he cannot trust immediately. But it is very certain, Dorothy. When it lands completely. Miller turned to her. He said quietly, "I'll need to make some calls. Give me 20 minutes. She said, "I know." He walked toward the house. She watched him go. Then she looked at the podium. At the oak tree behind it, its roots lifting the gravel at the edge of the drive, patient and insistent and entirely indifferent to the morning's events, doing what it had been doing for 40 years and intended to go on doing. She stepped down from the area near the podium. She did not look at Marcus. She did not look at the buyers with their raised voices and their legitimate grievances and their cashier's checks that had purchased nothing. She did not look at the numbered lots on the lawn or the auction sign at the end of the drive or any of the apparatus of a transaction that had been from the moment Dorothy walked out of the granary already over. She walked to the oak tree. She put her hand on the bark, the particular rough texture of old oak, the kind of surface that has been standing long enough to become something permanent rather than merely living. She stood there for a moment. Walter had planted this tree the year they were married. It was still here. So was she. The police arrived at 11:30. 2 vehicles, county plates, pulling onto the gravel drive with the unhurried competence of officers responding to a civil matter that has been clearly reported and documented. They did not come with sirens. They did not come with urgency. They came the way the law comes when the paperwork is in order, steadily, without theater, with the particular authority of people who know what they are there to do. Dorothy watched them from the porch. She had not called them. Miller had made that call from the kitchen, one of the calls he had said he needed 20 minutes for, and he had come back out with his coat buttoned and his briefcase closed, and the expression of a man who has set several things in motion and expects them to proceed as expected. They proceeded as expected. The officer who spoke to Marcus was a woman in her 40s with the practical patience of someone who has had this kind of conversation many times and has learned that the most efficient way to conduct it is without editorializing. She explained what had been reported. She explained what the county recorder's office had confirmed when Miller's office called. She explained the nature of the complaint, that 3 of the deposit-holding buyers had already filed, and the nature of the one that Miller had filed on Dorothy's behalf regarding the attempt to conduct a fraudulent sale of property not owned by the seller. Marcus stood in the middle of the yard that had been full of auction lots and strangers and the machinery of a transaction, and was now considerably quieter, most of the crowd having dispersed in the specific way of people who have realized they are adjacent to a legal situation and would prefer not to be. He stood there and listened to the officer, and his face went through several things. Dorothy watched from the porch. She watched without moving, without the forward lean of someone taking satisfaction in a spectacle, with the still attention she had been practicing all week, the attention of a woman who has decided to see things accurately rather than emotionally, and is doing so. Marcus looked at her once across the yard in the middle of whatever the officer was saying. It was a long look. The look of a man who has run a calculation in his head and arrived at a number he did not expect, and is searching for someone to hold responsible for the discrepancy. She did not look away. She did not look away, and she did not change her expression, and she did not offer him anything, not anger, not sympathy, not the performance of either. She simply looked back steadily until he looked away first. The deposit holders had not all left. 3 of them had stayed: the woman in the green coat, one of the men in work jackets, and the quieter of the 2 development buyers who had dismissed his partner an hour ago and remained apparently for the specific purpose of documentation. They had spoken to Miller. They had given their names and amounts to the officer taking the initial report. They had done this with the focused efficiency of people who have transitioned from being buyers to being complainants and are approaching the new role with professional seriousness. Marcus's financial exposure was not theoretical. It was the sum of the deposits he had accepted, the contract penalties his auctioneer's agreement carried for a halted sale, the legal costs that were beginning to accumulate, and whatever the civil proceedings would eventually produce. Dorothy did not know the exact number. She did not need to know it. She understood that the speed Marcus had used as his primary strategy, the 72-hour clock the auction before the week was out, had compressed the timeline in a way that ensured maximum witnesses and maximum documentation of every transaction. His speed had produced his evidence. Walter had said once about farming: a man who moves faster than the ground can hold him doesn't cover more distance. He just falls harder. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, when the officers had concluded their initial work and the remaining strangers had finally dispersed, Dorothy walked to the auction sign. It was still planted at the end of the drive, where Marcus had put it, the red and white of it somewhat incongruous now, against the November yard, a declaration that no longer had anything to declare. She pulled it from the ground. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it lighter than it looked, the way false authority usually is when you take hold of it directly. Then she set it on the ground and stepped on the center of it. It broke cleanly along the middle. The sound it made was small and specific. She picked up the 2 pieces and carried them to the equipment barn and left them inside. She did not make a production of it. There was no one watching, or almost no one. Francis was on the porch and saw it, and that was enough. She had not done it for an audience. She had done it because it needed to be done, and she was the person to do it, and that was the entirety of the reason. The yard was quiet by 3 o'clock. The numbered lots had been retrieved by their owners or the auction house workers. Walter's armchair had been carried back inside by Harold Briggs, who had returned after the police arrived and had done it without being asked, because Harold Briggs had known Walter for 50 years and understood without explanation what needed to happen. Dorothy sat on the porch with Francis. Francis had made tea. She had made it in the kitchen without asking, appearing with 2 cups in the way of a woman who has been a friend for long enough to know that asking is sometimes the wrong approach. They sat in the November afternoon and drank their tea, and the farm was quiet around them. The fields, the barn, the granary with its door now closed, the oak tree at the edge of the drive, standing in the late light. Dorothy said Walter didn't want to punish him, Francis. He just wanted to protect the house. Francis looked at her. She said he did both. Dorothy held her teacup in both hands. She thought about that. She thought about Walter in the county clerk's office 5 years ago, by himself paying the filing fee, and walking out with a copy of the deed, and driving home and putting it in the tin box under the granary floor. Not in anger, not in the expectation of drama. In the quiet, methodical way of a man who understood that the most durable kind of protection was the kind that didn't require him to be present to enforce it. Marcus had looked at her across the yard with his anger and his calculation and his final accounting of what he had lost. She had looked back. She had not felt what she expected to feel, which was something large and definitive. She had felt something smaller and more permanent, the feeling of a thing correctly resolved, of a property back in its rightful place, of a name back on the right document, of 40 years of a life confirmed as having belonged to the person who had lived it. Don't ever let someone else set the price of your home, Dorothy. She hadn't. The farm was quiet. The light was going low over the south field, the November light finding the angles it found this time of year, honest and unhurried, showing everything as it was. She was home. The kitchen was quiet by the time Francis left. She had stayed through the afternoon and into the early evening the way Frances stayed present without demanding useful, without requiring direction, the kind of company that asks nothing and gives everything simply by being in the room. She had made dinner that Dorothy ate half of and left the rest, and she had washed the dishes without comment, and at some point, near 7 o'clock, she had put on her coat and squeezed Dorothy's shoulder and said she would call in the morning, and she had gone. Dorothy sat at the kitchen table alone. The house was quiet around her, in the way it had been quiet every evening for 40 years. The settling sounds of old timber, the wind finding the gaps it always found in November, the familiar particular silence of a farmhouse at the end of a day. She had spent the last week understanding that the silence was different, now that it would always be different, that the difference was permanent, and she was learning to live inside it. Tonight the silence felt different from the silence of the past week. Tonight it felt like completion rather than absence. She reached into her coat pocket and took out Walter's letter. She had read it once in the granary in the low light with the auction sounds coming through the walls. She had not read it again since. She had carried it through everything that followed the auction halt, the police, the afternoon on the porch with Frances, and she had not taken it out again because she had understood without deciding it consciously that the right time to read it fully was here at this table in this light, when the day was finished and the house was hers, and there was nothing left to do but receive what Walter had written. She unfolded it under the kitchen lamp. His handwriting, the personal script slightly unsteady at the edges, in the way of his last years, but deliberate where it mattered. She read it slowly this time, the way you read something that deserves to be read at its own pace. He wrote about Marcus. Not with bitterness. She had known Walter long enough to know that bitterness was not a register he used, that he had made his peace with what his son was and had stopped expecting it to be different, which is a different thing from not caring. He wrote about it with the clear-eyed patience of a man who has observed something for a long time and has finally written down what he sees. He wrote, "I've watched Marcus for 30 years. He is not a bad man. He is a man who learned somewhere early that things have prices, and that the point is to know the price before anyone else does. I don't know where he learned it. I tried to teach him something else. I wasn't always successful." He wrote about the debt. He had known about it, not all of it, but enough. Marcus had come to him twice in the last 5 years asking for money, and Walter had given it the first time and the second time had said no, and explained why, and the explanation had not gone well. He wrote, "After the second conversation, I understood what would happen when I was gone. Not because Marcus is cruel, I want to be clear about that. Because he is desperate, and desperation makes people into the worst version of themselves. I have seen it before. I knew what it looked like." He wrote about the deed. He had gone to the county clerk's office on a Tuesday in October 5 years ago with the document he had prepared with a lawyer. Dorothy had never met a man Walter had found through a professional directory specifically chosen, because he had no connection to the family, no shared history, no line between himself and anyone who might eventually want to know what Walter had done and why. He had paid in cash. He had filed the deed himself, stood at the counter and watched the clerk stamp it and return the copy, and he had driven home and put the copy in the tin box under the granary floor, because the granary was the one building he was certain Marcus had no interest in. He had known Marcus would find the safe in the office. He had known Marcus would look for the obvious things in the obvious places. He had put the important thing in the unobvious place. He wrote the granary floor. Second board from the left wall in the back corner. I reinforced the beam myself so the board would lift cleanly. The box has been there for 5 years. I kept meaning to tell you, and I kept not telling you because every time I thought about how to say it, I thought about the look on your face, and I didn't want you to carry it. That was my mistake. You have always been stronger than I gave you credit for." And then the line she had read in the granary, the one that had stayed with her through everything that followed. "Marcus loves money more than he loves land. If I left him the farm, he would sell it in 3 days. I left it to you because you are the only one who understands that this is a home, not an asset. The difference between those two things is the whole point of everything." She set the letter down. She looked at the window, the kitchen window, the east-facing one, the one that would show her the gray pink of a November dawn in the morning, the way it showed it every morning, the way it had shown it for 40 years. She thought about Walter in his last months, the quietness she had read as withdrawal, as a man conserving himself for the time he had left. She understood it differently now. He had not been withdrawing. He had been building. The quietness of his last months had been the specific, focused quiet of a man completing something, making calls, making arrangements, making sure the thing that needed to be true would be true in a way that held even after he was gone. She thought about him planting the oak tree in the first year of their marriage. She had asked him why he was planting something that wouldn't be fully grown for 20 years. He had looked at her with the slight smile of a man who has thought further ahead than the question assumes. He had said, "This tree needs 20 years to put down roots. So do we. I'm planting it now, so both of them are ready when they need to be." She had thought he was being sentimental. He had been describing the only philosophy he ever had, which was to build things that would hold long after you needed them to hold, and to build them quietly, so that when the time came, there was nothing to argue with. Frances came back. Dorothy had not heard the door. She had been too far inside, the letter inside the evening, inside the long accumulation of a 40-year marriage, arriving at its final accounting. But the door opened and Frances came in, and she did not say anything about coming back, just set a fresh cup of tea on the table beside the letter and sat down across from Dorothy with her own cup. She looked at the letter. She looked at Dorothy. She said he loved you the best way he knew how. Dorothy looked at the letter on the table. At Walter's handwriting, slightly unsteady at the edges, deliberate where it mattered. At the words that had been sitting in a rusted tin box under a granary floor for 5 years, waiting for the morning they were needed. She said he loved me the way he built things. Frances looked at her. Dorothy said to last. She picked up her tea. Outside, the November night was doing its quiet work on the farm, the fields, the barn, the oak tree. At the edge of the drive, the granary with its floorboard back in place and the tin box still inside, because there was no reason to move it now, because some things are right where they belong. The house was hers. It had always been hers. Walter had made sure the county agreed. Sunday came quietly. No vehicles on the gravel drive. No strangers with clipboards. No auction podium under the oak tree, no numbered lots along the fence, no voices calling opening bids on 40 years of a life that had never been anyone's to sell. Just the birds in the south field moving through the November grass the way they always moved this time of year, low, purposeful, undisturbed. Just the wind finding its way across the open land the way it had found it every morning for 40 years. Just the farm, doing what the farm did when people left it alone, which was simply to be itself. Dorothy was up before the light. She made coffee and carried it to the kitchen table and sat with it in the early dark, the way she had sat every morning for 4 decades, and she watched the gray pink of the dawn come up over the south field, and she let it be what it was, not the last time, not a farewell, not a view she was looking at with the particular attention of someone saying goodbye. Just the morning. Her morning on her farm, in her house, the way it would be tomorrow and the day after that. She spent the morning putting things back. Walter's armchair. Harold had carried it inside the day before, set it in the hallway, rather than its proper place, perhaps not knowing exactly where it belonged. She knew. She moved it back to the corner of the sitting room, to the spot where the light was right in the afternoon, and where the particular compression of the cushion from 40 years of Walter sitting in it still held the shape of him. She set it there and stood back and looked at it. She did not sit in it. Not yet. That was for a different morning when she was ready. She went through the rooms systematically the way she had walked through them the day she came home slowly with full attention, her hand trailing the door frames. She straightened what had been moved. She returned things to the surfaces they belonged on. The blue ceramic lamp to the side table in the sitting room. The frame photograph of the farm in its first year before the equipment barn was built to the nail on the kitchen wall, where it had hung for 30 years. She moved through the house the way you move through a place that is yours, not possessively, not with the energy of someone reclaiming something, with the ease of someone returning to where they belong. Miller had called the previous evening to report the formal status. The county recorder had confirmed the deed. The auction had been officially nullified. The deposit holders had been directed to pursue their claims against Marcus directly, which they were doing with the organized efficiency of people with lawyers and documented losses. Marcus had retained counsel. What happened next between Marcus and the buyers and whatever investigation the county chose to pursue was a matter that no longer required Dorothy's direct involvement. Miller had also told her briefly and without elaboration that Walter had left a note in the file, a brief statement of intent drafted on the same day as the deed filed with the same attorney who had drafted it, attesting that the transfer was made freely and knowingly and for the specific purpose of ensuring Dorothy's permanent security in the property. He had thought of that too. Of course he had. In the afternoon, she framed the documents. She had bought 2 frames in town the previous week, plain wood clean glass, the kind that would hold something properly without making a fuss about itself. She placed the deed in one and Walter's letter in the other, matted in white the way she would mat anything worth preserving. She hung them beside the front door, not hidden, not decorative in the way that something without meaning is decorative, present, visible. The deed on the left, its legal language, its county seal, her name in the grantee line, and the letter on the right, Walter's handwriting filling the page, the slightly unsteady edges, and the deliberate centers of a man who had something to say and said it precisely. She stepped back and looked at them. Every person who came through her door would pass them. She would pass them every morning on the way out and every evening on the way in, and they would mean what they meant, not a record of a conflict won, not a monument to what Marcus had tried, but the evidence of a man who had loved his wife with a specific, practical, forward-looking love, of someone who understood that love without preparation is only feeling, and feeling alone does not hold when the hard weather comes. In the late afternoon, she walked to the oak tree. The light was going low over the south field, the November light at its most honest angle, the light that showed things as they were. She walked across the yard and stood at the base of the tree and put her hand on the bark. It was rough under her palm, the particular texture of old oak, not smooth, not yielding, but solid in a way that communicated something about duration, about a thing that has been standing long enough to become a different kind of permanent than young things are permanent. Walter had planted it the year they were married. He had said it needed 20 years to put down roots. So do we. He had been right. He had always been right about the things that grew slowly, the things that required patience and time, and the willingness to tend them through the years when they were not yet what they were going to be. She stood with her hand on the bark and looked out at the farm, the fields, the granary, the equipment barn, the house with its kitchen light already on, warm against the late afternoon. She thought about Walter, not with grief, not with the acute particular pain of the week that had passed, but with something that lived alongside grief, the way gratitude lives alongside loss. The feeling of having been loved carefully, specifically, by someone who had thought further ahead than most people think to look. She said quietly to the bark under her hand, to the roots under the ground, to whatever persists of a person in the things they have planted and built and prepared. They could sell the timber, they could sell the brick, but they could never sell us Walter. The tree said nothing. The farm said nothing. But the light was warm on the south field, and the house was lit, and the deed was framed beside the front door, and the tin box was still in the granary where Walter had put it, its work finish now resting in the dark under the floor where it had waited 5 years to be needed. She turned and walked back to the house. The gravel drive was empty, the auction sign broken in the equipment barn, the oak tree standing behind her in the late light, its roots continuing their slow, patient work of making the ground their own. She went up the front steps. She paused at the door and looked at the framed documents inside the glass, the deed and the letter side by side, Walter's handwriting visible through the pane. Then she opened the door and went inside. The kitchen was warm. The coffee she had made an hour ago was still on the counter, still warm enough. She poured a cup. She sat at the kitchen table, her kitchen table in her kitchen in her house on her 42 acres, and she wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the east window where the last of the November light was doing its honest work on the glass. Tomorrow, the light would come through that window the same way it had come through it for 40 years. She would be here to see it. Walter had made sure of that. She was home. She had always been home. He had just made sure the county agreed.